rock layers going up and down and bent back up. Let's just do an experiment. Now let's start to bend it. Didn't bend, did it? This would be a representation of a protein molecule. Just pull it on out of there.
Well, let's see.
You're not far enough away yet. We need some room for this molecule. If you can envision the entire universe as this box, and inside the box you've got jewels. Either the box made itself, or something outside of the box made the box. Topic of the day is mankind being made in the image of God. 4 times God told us that. Must be important. We are made in God's image. Male and female, He made us in His image. And He says it 4 times in 4 ways. And there's probably some significance to that. And I'm going to wrap up talking about one of those ways, which is the theme of this lecture, our intelligence and our creativity. Nothing else out there exhibits that, except mankind and God and potentially the angels. But just by way of background, we as Christians have been given one primary job to do. God made us all for this purpose. If we simply share with the next generation the mighty acts of God as if we ourselves believe them, it's going to impact their lives. Now, the world around us is working 24/7 to deny the mighty acts of God. So who's going to present them as if they're real? And just once again, by way of background, the church spends a lot of time and effort, and with good reason, talking about the most mighty act, the mightiest act of God. And that was to enter into creation, become a human being, and take the penalty of sin, which is death, upon Himself, so we could come back into fellowship with Him. But the church at large, not organizations like this, but the church at large really doesn't, they give lip service to it, but they don't spend a lot of time talking about the other mighty acts of God. The literal creation of very separate kinds of creatures. 10 times God says that. Trees make trees, birds make birds, fish make fish. There haven't been millions and billions of years of death on this planet. It's here because of our actions, which means it couldn't have been there before our actions. We get that wrong, we misinterpret everything. A literal, real, world-covering deluge. We get that wrong, we misinterpret history. And the spreading out of people around this planet with different languages. Now, those are real events. They really happened in real time, in real space, in real history. And if we don't treat them that way, they become just a bunch of Grimm's fairy tales to the world around us, all right? Now, if we don't get the creation of separate creatures right, we misinterpret biology. If we don't get the entrance of death as a result of our actions right, we misinterpret the age of things and where death comes from in the very nature and character of God. If we don't get the worldwide flood right, we misinterpret the rock layers, the fossils, all of that stuff. See, it's not a huge human conspiracy. It may be a spiritual conspiracy, but it's simply we start from the wrong starting point by leaving God's word out, and everything else gets misinterpreted. Now, if these things are true, okay, and they are, there ought to be evidence for every single one of them in these ancient cultures. There should be a remembrance of these things somewhere other than the Bible. And that makes the Bible way more credible to the world around us. That's why this presentation is so important. And then the most momentous great act of God, as I mentioned, is really His demonstration of love for us. And with good reason, we spend a lot of time there. Okay, that was all background. Now, you have to understand how the world works and how they think if you're going to affect their thinking. And there are only 2 possibilities for our existence, okay? And I've done this before, but it's kind of my trademark. I like to think of all of creation as a huge box, all of the universe and the stars and the time and the space and the matter. I mean, either the box made itself or the box has a box maker. And if you look inside of it and it's filled with beautiful jewels, it's a jewelry box. Those are like these way more intricately created animals and plants and ecosystems all around us. That's the jewels inside the box. Either they made themselves, something turned into something else, that turned into something else, that eventually turned into people, or they were created. Now, you have got to prepare your children and grandchildren for what they're up against in school. they dare to walk into any university class and say, I believe God literally made people, there weren't people and then there were, they will be ridiculed, they will be made to feel like idiots, they will be scoffed at, they will be scorned, they will be in the incredible minority, even though it's the truth. Because this is what is taught as an absolute fact. If God didn't make us, something must have turned into us. What looks like us? Some sort of ape-like creature. Now, I want to show you a little clip from a film which has been called the most impactful, the most well-done science fiction film ever made in the 100-year history of cinematography. Now, what do you think that is? The best, greatest ever science fiction film? Some guesses. What was that? Star Wars. Star Wars. Yep, I always get that. That's not it. Other guesses. Jurassic Park. 2001, A Space Odyssey. That's the answer. You poll the critics, you poll the folks who really study cinematography and their effect on a culture. 2001 gets the top of the list every time. I'm going to show you a little clip from that because I want you to understand the world's perception of reality. And in this film, for the first 20 minutes, you see nothing but apes running around, fighting each other, throwing sticks at each other, grunting, screaming, sleeping together, and etc., until you get to this seminal moment in the film. Now, interestingly, here's an alien monolith. It's aliens that allowed mankind to become human beings, okay? That's kind of the theme of the movie. And he gets this thought. Oh, gee, there's a pile of bones. I wonder what I could do with this pile of bones. You can't see it real well, but he's tipping his head one way, and now the music builds, okay? The suspense, the drama, the majesty of it all. I mean, these things are well done. And then he thinks, maybe if I pick up one of these bones, I could use it as perhaps a tool. And he uses it to slap the ground with it. And another bone flies up. And his little monkey brain is thinking. He's putting two and two together for the first time in his little monkey life. And he realizes, wow, if I hit it harder, the bones fly higher. Maybe I can use this bone for other things. And he realizes what I have here is a tool. I have a tool that I can use to help myself survive. And by the way, the movie goes from here, and he throws the bone up into the air, and it turns into a spaceship in outer space, and it moves on to a science fiction film of exploration. But there's Grandpa. Now, doesn't that just give you a warm, fuzzy feeling all over about who we are and where we came from? But see, that is reality to the majority of the people that we see as we walk down the street, an increasing majority. Now, at the end, I'm going to talk about how can that be? How can they possibly believe that? In spite of the kind of things I'm about to show you, not because of the things I'm about to show you. You see, the world around us increasingly views everything through this evolutionary perception filter. And if that's true, then the farther back we go in time, the more ignorant people had to have been. They hadn't developed technology yet. They hadn't figured out things yet. The farther back we go in time, the less their building abilities was developed, the less language ability they would have had, the less social structure there would have been, the less inventiveness. That had to be the reality of the past. So when archaeologists and historians, they'll go back in the rock layers, and that's their perception filter, they're going to interpret what they find based on what they believe to be reality. It's the only possible way they can interpret things, because it is reality in their minds. They've been trained to think that way. Now, what is left out is the only other possibility, is that we were created. Now, the focus of this next hour is the evidence that all cultures and all mankind have of these biblical big events of God and their obvious intelligent inventiveness from the very get-go, from the very inceptions of civilizations. There hasn't been this slow, gradual development. It's like enormous, creativity has been there right away. Now, what I'm going to do is assume God's word means what it says, all right? Now, you would think a God capable of creating an insect that could dissolve itself inside of a cocoon and come out turning itself into a butterfly, a God who could make 100 billion galaxies with 100 billion stars in each one and know the name of every one of them, you would think that God would be able to communicate to mankind what he did, when he did, and how he did it. And it would be understandable to someone 5,000 years ago, and it would be understandable to a PhD physicist professor in a college today. Wouldn't you think a God could do that? It's exactly what he's done. It's just we choose to professing to be wise, become fools, and don't want to believe what it says. Now, if you just add up what God says, in Genesis chapter 5, it says Adam was born, or created, I'm sorry, and he had a son, and after so many years, who had a son after so many years. You can add all those years up, and you come up with about 2,000 years to Abraham. And biblically, we know there's been about 2,000 years from Abraham to Jesus, and historically, 2,000 years from Jesus to us. You get about 6,000 years, ballpark, of Earth history. And by the way, Jesus said, have you not read, in the beginning, I made them male and female human beings. The Bible starts, at the beginning, I made them heaven and earth. People were made at the very beginning. Hasn't been this huge gap of time. So let's assume it means what it says. I'm going to break it into eras, okay? What was happening the first, 1,700 years of Earth history? And by the way, there's some scholarly debate which manuscript, whether the flood was 4,350 years ago, whether it was at worst about 4,800 years ago. I'm going to take the worst case scenario. The flood literally happened about 4,350 years ago, and see, well, how do things fit? How does world history fit? Now, here's the problem. In the New Testament, it says the flood deluged and destroyed. The world that then existed no longer exists. The flood wiped out everything. Every building, every tree, every blade of grass was ripped up. Every mountain was repositioned. The mountains of the earth were built up after the flood as continents were apparently moving around. That's the best current explanation from most creation geologists. So all that stuff's redeposited, redistributed. Everything's gone. So how can we know about anything that existed or happened before the flood? It has to be historical records. And just to ground you in this, because the flood is central to everything we do to interpret Earth history. If we get the flood wrong, we get the Ice Age wrong. If we get the flood wrong, we get the dates of things wrong. It's central to everything else we interpret about Earth history and cultures. I want to give you a little picture of the flood to put in your brain. This is a 2-minute clip of the tsunami that hit Japan less than 10 years ago, all right? And there was a guy standing on a roof that filmed this, and I want you to watch the power of moving water. Okay. Don't need all the water flowing sound. But there's a Japanese gentleman standing on a roof. The ocean is several miles down this river, but the water came from the ocean, from this tsunami wave, and shoved everything backwards. So the river's flowing backwards now up into this little town. And you can see the road, it's just starting, the sirens are going off. And there's cars just being swept from upstream, downstream, and they're being shoved over this retaining wall. And now the water's flowing into this parking lot. And you'll notice it's just up a foot or two. And by the way, I shortened this 5-minute clip to about 2 minutes because I wanted you to see this very clearly. But now the road is covered. It's maybe 4 or 5 feet deep, and it's continuing to rise and slamming up against this building. Now look at this town. I would stop it if I could from here. But there's a little peaceful Japanese town, and the water's just slowly flowing into the town, all right? And it continues to rise, shoving cars up against this little parking garage kind of building. Now he's going to sweep back to the river in a second. Now you notice the water's probably 6, 8 feet deep. Those light poles are starting to snap off. The tree later snaps off. It just picked up this warehouse, picked up off its foundation. Just water, what's the big deal? Slams that entire, probably million-pound building into this other structure, completely crushes it from the flowing water. There goes a semi-truck, probably weighing 30,000 pounds, floating down through there. All the gaylords are coming tumbling out, just crushed it like an accordion. The water's maybe 12, 15 feet deep now. By the way, look at the hills behind there. Those are maybe 30 feet tall. Keep that in mind. It's not going to get that high. But look at the town now. The whole town is moving. There's not a building that survived. There's not a structure that wasn't picked up and lifted. That garage just got shoved forward. Everything is going to be gone. Now, the water level rise here was about 20 feet. During Noah's flood, there were areas of the earth where there was probably 1,000-foot waves of water. Think of this water covering every hill you see behind there, and then being hundreds of feet above that hill. Enormous destruction would be happening. There would be nothing left. The water gets higher, these buildings they're standing on would have disappeared. So get the picture in your mind. Nothing survived Noah's flood. That's why the fossils are there by the trillions throughout the rock layers. Now that was like a drop in an Olympic swimming pool compared to what was going on all over the earth during the flood God's word talks about. So what do we find? The book Brilliant that I passed around, it's broken into eras. It's the sections, what was going on from 6,000 to the flood, what was going on right after the flood. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff, but I'm just going to pick one example of the kind of things that mankind still knows about from before the flood. And it's a bronze tree that was dug up in China about 30 years ago. Now, it's believed, even by people who get the time frames wrong, that this is about 4,000 years old. So it's something that was built after the flood. It's 12 foot tall, and it's a bronze casting of a tree with limbs and leaves and so on. Now, interestingly enough, the leaves on this tree are shaped like knives, and nestled amongst the knives is a fruit. All right? So you have what is symbolic of a forbidden fruit on this tree, which is kind of interesting in and of itself. All right? This is what it looks like. These knife-shaped things, and there in the midst of the knives is a fruit, okay, surrounded by knives, a forbidden fruit. Okay, now if you look at the base of the tree, there is a snake, okay? And he looks kind of vicious, you know, he's got teeth that's barred out. And by the way, this snake happens to have legs. It's something in the Bible about snakes after the fall lost legs. And then there's a human hand reaching toward the fruit in the tree. So you have a tree with forbidden fruit, a human being reaching toward the fruit, and a snake guarding that tree. What does that sound like? They're trying to portray an actual event that happened in history that brought death into creation. You couldn't make this stuff up. Now, this has nothing related directly to God's Word. This is 4,000 years old before Moses ever even began to pen Genesis. And yet here are people living in a culture totally separated from Israel that have exactly the same concepts of what's going on. The one thing they wanted the next generation to know was, why does death exist? Where did death come from? Why does evil exist? What did sin bring upon us? Because Noah told this to his children. And then people spread out across the earth, and these people who ended up in China told it to their children, and they wanted to memorialize this event. Makes perfect sense. Two independent sources of information confirming a historical fact. People need to see these sort of things, but they'll never see them in their textbooks unless we share them with people. So that was just one example. Stuff's gone from before the flood, but there's knowledge of true events that happened that still are in existence. And it's not just God's Word. God wants the truth to be known, and it shows up in cultures all over the world. So what was going on immediately after the flood? Okay, just in the big picture, mankind is struggling to reestablish a foothold upon planet Earth. Now, this just gets totally left out of the thinking of the secular world. They don't even begin to go there because they deny there's ever been a flood. So they're not going to understand what they find. Now, there would have been several hundred years past, I'm guessing, before the Tower of Babel. There had to be a lot of people building this structure. It doesn't say in Scripture. But after that, multiple cultures went out across the earth. The flood guaranteed an ice age. That's where the ice age fits. It followed the flood immediately. It started immediately after the flood. It started snowing in Canada within months of the flood. Because there was more evaporation, it came down as snowfall, and the ice built up for hundreds of years. Okay? Ocean levels would have lowered after the flood. During the Ice Age, there's lots of evidence the oceans were 200 to 400 feet lower. That's an enormous amount of water. It was all tied up as ice. Europe and North America would have been covered. The Middle East and the equatorials would have never seen snow, but it would have been wetter worldwide. And there would have been lots of geological activity. Now, all this factors into what you're about to see with what was going on in cultures. Now, here's the first question I had to ask myself. What were the earliest cultures known on Earth to have developed? And you hear the Chinese, the Egyptians, the Incas, or the early Peruvians before the Incas, so on. These cultures are very early cultures on the Earth. And the Egyptian is kind of the chronometer for all the rest of the world cultures. They time the Babylonians and all these other guys based on what they think they know about the Egyptians, because we've got lots of records from the Egyptians. And the Bible mentions the Egyptians extensively. Now, the first thing I had to figure out for myself is, how could there have been so many people in Egypt? Let me back up. You see, biblically, if you track down the dates, you find out that Abraham showed up in Egypt about 3,900 years ago. The Bible puts the flood at 4,350 years ago. That's only 450 years. How do you get a bunch of people, Tower of Babel, cultures spreading around the world, and literally probably millions of people building an advanced Egyptian civilization in only 400 years? Well, I thought, well, let's just kind of make some logical assumptions to see if we can figure it out. Now, the first thing I realized, we're all trained to think in a certain way. Today, 3 kids is a big family. You had 3 kids? Wow. That's the way young people think, okay? When I grew up, and it hasn't been that long ago, we had 3 families in our neighborhood that had a dozen kids. It wasn't that abnormal. That was kind of normal, okay? So just because something's a way today doesn't mean it's the same way in the past. So let me throw out another question to you. What do you think is the record in modern historical times for a single woman having the most children? How many children do you think a single woman has had? 26, 25, more than that? 47, more than that? Yeah. 56, I heard up to 100. Let me give you the answer. This is the modern documented example, 69 children. In the late 1700s, started in her teens, ended up in her 50s, pregnant her entire adult life, had many twins and triplets. But then I looked on Wikipedia, they documented 50 women just in the last few decades that have had 20 or more children. Now, think about after Noah got off the ark. Mankind would have been motivated to have very large families. People were living much longer. There were less genetic mistakes. Every generation has more mistakes than the generation before. Your children have more genetic mistakes than you, and you have more than your parents. So you go back in time, there were less and less and less. Documented genetic fact of science. We know this is true. The magnetic field of the Earth, we know scientifically, gets stronger as you go back in time, which means less harmful effect from the sun. All these things leading to why people lived longer, okay? I think there were probably less mutations of pathogens. And we know this because people married close relations way back in history. Abraham was married to his half-sister. The Egyptians routinely married off brothers and sisters, as did all these other ancient Babylonian cultures, with no seeming detrimental effect. Less mistakes, so close relations could get married. Wasn't until almost 3,000 years after creation, at the time of Moses, that God said, close relations can't get married. Because by then there were so many mistakes built up. All right? So, lots of mixing, lots of motivation, very long lifetimes. So I'm going to make an assumption. I'm going to assume every couple that came off the ark had 20 kids over a 50-year period. Remember, they're still living much longer lifetimes. There's not as many mistakes on their genes. So that's not at all unreasonable for someone living 50 years, living hundreds of years to have 50 or 20 children in 50 years. By the way, you get essentially these same numbers if you say the average family had 10 kids over a 25-year period, and the generations are faster. Okay, it's the same essential answer. Well, that means 50 years after the ark landed, there would have been 68 people on the planet. The original 8 plus each of the 3 couples had 20 kids. 100 years later, those 60 young people would have paired up into 30 couples, each of them having 20 kids. There would have been 600 people. 150 years later, you have 3,000 couples. 200 years later, you have 30,000 couples. See how fast populations grow?
And then if you add all the original people that are still alive, because it's only 200 years later, longer lifetimes, you have about 66,000 people. I'm going to arbitrarily put the Tower of Babel at this point, okay? So that's 4,150 years ago. 70, and I just picked a number, and it could have been less, it could have been more, but I'm going to say 70 groups of people moved out from the Tower of Babel to create cultures. The Chinese culture, the Inca culture, the Egyptian culture, the European culture, whatever. They moved down into Australia, the Aborigines. They're moving out over the world with different languages. Well, if you divide the 30,000 couples by 70, you find out there's 428 couples per group moving out to create some new civilization. Well, add another 50 years, and 4,100 years ago, one of those groups ends up in Egypt, you would have had 4,000 couples. 50 years ago, you have 42,000 couples. 4,000 years ago, you could have 400,000 couples. 3,900 years ago, you have 4 million couples. When Abraham arrived in Egypt, it's not even a stretch that you could have had 42 million people. That's how fast populations grow. See, what that shows is this whole idea people have been around for tens of thousands of years doesn't make sense. They've always shown intelligence, an ability to plant, an ability to grow, an ability to hunt. They would have grown much faster. There should have been civilizations much sooner. The actual civilizations fit a biblical timeline. Now, a sin had already entered. It was already rampant. They were wiping each other out. They were enslaving each other. They were killing each other. So there probably weren't that many people, and not all families probably had that many folks. But the point is, there's plenty of time for these civilizations to have developed in a biblical timeline. So let's look at the Egyptian civilization.
And by the way, those who study Egypt, the earlier pyramids, the Great Pyramid of Giza and some of those other ones, are way more finely crafted and precisely built than the later pyramids. Early in their culture, they seem to have more abilities than later in their culture. Now, they found about 130 pyramids in Egypt, and they're still uncovering some now and then, smaller ones underneath of sand dunes. And the oldest one, I believe, goes back right around 4,000 years ago. Now, they'll place it at 6,000. And by the way, here's just an interesting note. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, you look in any textbook on Egypt in England and Europe, and they would say, Egypt is 9,000 years ago their culture started. Okay, it's taught as a fact in their textbooks based on all their modern ability and archaeological evidence. But then they found the Rosetta Stone, all right? And they were able to, let me back up. They found the Rosetta Stone, and that's what led them to this idea of a 9,000-year-old Egypt. They were able to decipher the hieroglyphics. And they added up the reigns of the pharaohs and how long they said they lived and how many of them there were, and they came up with 9,000 years to the age of the pyramids. And it was taught as a fact. But then as we learned more and more, we started to realize it didn't fit. It didn't fit the other cultures. It didn't fit the evidence. They couldn't be that old. And they realized that these guys exaggerated because their pharaohs were godlike, how long they reigned, and they put the southern and northern kingdoms consecutive instead of simultaneous. It'd be like you add up all of the terms of all the governors of America, of all the 50 states, and you say America is 2,000 years old because we've added up the length of all the governors. Well, they were simultaneous. You can't add them up. They did this with the pharaohs, and they came up with the wrong age. So they arbitrarily lopped 3,000 years off the history of Egypt, you know, through 20, 30, 40 years ago. Well, if they arbitrarily can lop 3,000 years off, how do we know they're right about the 6,000 years? It's a really good question. And by the way, archaeologically, the things they use to date the cultures of the world are the documents, which they don't know if they're right. Carbon dating, which is based on the assumption there's always been the same amount of unstable carbon-14 in the past as there is today, and the flood would have guaranteed a disruption, so that's going to be wrong as you approach things of the flood. And the Ice Age, which is assumed to have happened from 200,000 to 20,000 years ago. And if you get the Ice Age wrong, you put the development of cultures wrong. So you get the wrong dates for all these cultures. And just looking at the Great Pyramid, the biggest one, it has about 5 billion pounds of limestone, 1.3 million blocks, shaped, quarried, moved, some of them from up to 500 miles away. Now, those kind of numbers just roll off our back. That sounds like a lot. But I thought, you know what? I'm going to take what the encyclopedias say about the Great Pyramid
and I'm going to see how feasible is this. And they tell us they believe it took about 20 years to build the Great Pyramid. It was when the pharaohs came to rule till he died, and he was building it as his tomb. So all of them say it took about 20 years. I'm not making this up. So you divide 2.3 million blocks by 20 years, it turns out these guys had to have cut to absolute precision each one of these 5,000-pound blocks of limestone, moved it from up to 500 miles away, dropped it into position one every 5 minutes, 24 hours a day, nonstop, 365 days a year, nonstop, in order to have built this thing in 20 years. I'm not sure we could do that today. That's what those 2.3 million blocks represent. Unbelievable achievement from the very get-go of human civilization. And then they covered it with these marble capstones, okay? These things were 12 foot long. They were sloped and cut into a step shape so they would fit into the steps of the pyramid and form a perfectly smooth, level surface. This thing must have shone like a spotlight from 20 miles away, just covered with gleaming white marble. Now, all those have been removed and used around Cairo and fallen off, but in the early 1800s, a scientist found hundreds of them, measured them, and discovered they were cut to an accuracy of plus or minus 1/16 of an inch. Thousands and thousands and thousands of them, plus or minus 1/16 of an inch. I don't know if stone quarries could do that today, and yet they did it 4,000 years ago. And then they had to level the base, because if the base isn't level, then the stones you're stacking on the base aren't level, and then the sides aren't level, and then the capstones don't fit. See, everything has to be perfect if it's going to really work right. It was leveled, this 14-acre base, like multiply this room by about 100 times, okay, to within 0.001 inch per foot. From one end of the 14 acres to the other, it's only off by less than an inch. Now, I can't send a metal plate to a modern, computer-driven CNC milling machine today and get a square foot plate milled to plus or minus 0.001 inch without specialized equipment. Most machine shops could never do that. And yet they did it 4,000 years ago with a 14-acre site before starting the pyramid. And then they decided they want this pyramid to be in a absolutely critical astronomical position. So it's located at exactly 1/3 of the way between the equator to the North Pole, which is a really important position on the Earth. They had to have known the Earth was round in order to do this. And they had to know how big the Earth was in order to do this. And they aligned it within 0.02% of a single degree of the compass to a north-south magnetic field of the Earth. Now, in the 1860s, we built the Greenwich Observatory in London, England. We decided to align that to the Earth's magnetic field. In the 1800s, okay, we have all of our modern scientific technology and building abilities. We were only able to align the Greenwich Observatory to 0.06% of a single degree. 4,000 years earlier, the Egyptians did it 3 times better.
Stupid, ignorant, slowly evolving human beings? Where's the evidence? Absolutely not. Brilliant, technologically advanced. Now, technology builds upon previous knowledge. They didn't have necessarily everything we know, but they obviously were capable of enormous accomplishments. Now, that's one end of the spectrum right after the flood. Okay, in the other end of the spectrum, you have people struggling to eke out an existence in an Ice Age, very harsh environment. So you have these things we call Neanderthals found in Germany. Now, this is exactly the same period of Earth history. They looked a little different than the very norm. They probably got pushed to the fringes of society. They were trying to find shelter during an Ice Age. Where are you going to live? In caves. And that's where we find some of their cultures. Lived in Ice Age in Europe, but they cared for their elderly. They've been shown these folks, some of them had broken bones early in life. They were taking care of, the bones mended, and they lived to an old age. They buried their dead with artifacts, which means, why would you put something valuable with a dead body? Because you think there's something that comes after this life. They knew this isn't all there is. Modern man has lost that idea. Our life is not all there is. There's something that comes after this life.
They hunted in coordinated hunting parties, bringing down enormously huge animals that they used for food and clothing, and they were brilliantly inventive. I came across a paper when I was researching this book, and the headline said, Neanderthals invent superglue. I thought, what's that all about? Turns out, as I read through it, they had figured out if they take the resin from a certain tree, like a birch-type tree that has a very oily sap, and they heat it to a specific temperature and exclude oxygen, and they hold it for a very specific period of time, they can get it to cross-link and turn into a very sticky glue-type substance. Now, here's the thing. If you're a Neanderthal and you've got a great big old spearhead and you want to bring down a mastodon and you attach it to your spear and you're out there hunting, and all of a sudden a saber-toothed tiger comes out and he's coming at you, and you pull your spear back to throw it at him, and your spearhead falls off, it is not a good day, okay? Bad, bad, very bad, rotten, horrible, no good day. So they took like animal sinew or rawhide, they would wrap it around the spearhead, but then they'd take this glue, attach it to that, and it would form a very hard bond that wasn't brittle, but would stay fixed to the, it would keep it there. Well, these guys in this research, they tried to repeat it, okay? They realized the only way it would work is if you hold it to a very specific temperature, and I think it's in the book, but I think it's like between 550 and 650 degrees. You have to exclude oxygen, and you have to keep it there for only about an hour. If you heat it too long, it cross-links too much and it doesn't work. If you don't exclude oxygen, it bursts into flames. If you don't heat it enough, it doesn't cross-link. If you heat it too high, it turns into a block of carbon. They spent weeks working on how in the world can we reproduce this. You know, they put the resin under a rock and they built a fire on top of the rock and so on. Finally, they figured they made 50 grams of the stuff, which is just a teeny little bit. They said we succeeded in reproducing what these ancient, ignorant human beings had done. They didn't say that, but that's what they're implying. But then you read further down and they said, well, we only succeeded by burying modern thermocouples in there in order to maintain the temperature. We had to use modern technology to reproduce what these guys did 4,000 years ago with no modern technology. Stupid, ignorant, ape-like creatures. They're brilliantly inventive. And then they're artistic. You know, I couldn't begin to paint what some of these guys painted on their cave walls. They have literally 10,000 paintings on some of these caves in France. They reproduced the running gait of a horse more accurately than most modern painters can reproduce it, how they lift and move their feet. They were very, very observant.
They painted this pride of lions using the three-dimensional structure of the wall, so it came out at you in 3 dimensions when they painted it on their walls. Here's a beautiful gazelle from Africa, paintings on walls. This isn't some guy, you know, that's grabbed some old chunk of burnt log, grabs his wife by the hair, drags her across and says, fix me some food while I draw on the wall, yet with an old hunk of wood out of the fire. Very, very intelligent human beings living in a harsh period of Earth history. That's who they are, the Cro-Magnon, the Neanderthal. And then language development during this period of time. Immediately, people start developing languages after the flood. Now, the Chinese developed what I think is probably one of the most complex writing systems of all humanity. They started to make these little characters that meant things. You know, and there's this huge long list of them. This one happens to mean, by the way, diarrhea, which you have to have a symbol for toilet, so that's a symbol for toilet right following it, and so on. Here's an ancient whale bone where they have inscribed writing right on it. It goes right back to the beginning of Chinese civilizations. But they went from very, very complex to very, very simple. The original Chinese language had 80,000 symbols. Now think about the alphabet song, A, B, C, D, E, with 80, they never end. You'd never get your kid to bed. You know, 80,000 symbols. But many of them are tied to historical meanings. I mean, you gotta make it up these symbols and combine them to mean things, okay? So here's just 2 examples. The Chinese symbol for garden, okay, that's what it looks like. And it's actually a combination of this little thing right here, this little upside down T thing is a symbol for dust. This little square underneath of it is a symbol for breath. This little K looking thing is a symbol for 2 people. And the big outside square is the symbol for an enclosure. So 2 people, or dust given breath, created 2 people in an enclosure. What does that sound like? Where did they get this concept? Noah told them where we came from, and they worked it right into their very language that they developed. Here's a Chinese symbol for boat. It's got a symbol for some sort of vessel that has 8 people. 8 people on a vessel is a boat. Why 8? Why on a vessel? Because Noah's Ark was the boat, and these people remembered it. And just while we're looking at writing, one of the things I think Dennis has back here, in Peru they had no written language. But people are creative. People are inventive. They develop different systems. They developed in Peru what they call the quipus, okay? Now, it's a cord that goes across the top with a bunch of cords dangling from it that have knots tied to them. And this is what one of them might look like. Now, the Inca Empire was about 3,000 miles long. From New York to Los Angeles, it ran up and down over the mountains. They built what they call the Inca Highway, steps running up and down the mountains the whole length of their kingdom. Well, the emperor, he wants to tell something to somebody at the other end of the kingdom, but there's no written language. So he has his scribes start tying knots in these cords, okay? Now, there's different color cords, there's different length cords, there's different numbers of knots, there's different positions of knots, there's different size knots. Those are like our letters. Each one has a different letter. So they roll it, put it in a tube, a runner would run flat out, hand it to the next runner, hand it to the next runner, hand it to the next runner. In about 2 weeks, they could run a message from one end of their kingdom to the other. The other end, he would unroll it and they would read it like we would read a newspaper. Isn't that inventive? It's just a different form of written communication. And we don't even know how to translate them. It's all been lost as the Spanish wiped these guys out. So that's the kind of things that we're developing really quick. A wide span of abilities, but it fits. It just fits biblically. It makes perfect sense. There's no reason to reject it or ignore it. So what's going on for the next 1,000 years of Earth history? Well, this period of history was literally characterized by massive building projects. Now, I have my own theory of what's going on here. Mankind was just wiped out by a flood, okay? And as they start to step away from their trust in God and realizing He promised He'd never send another flood, they are still living in fear and stories. And I mean, this made an impression. And they start building massive building projects, starting with the Tower of Babel. And the people spread out from Babel, they continued this. The Ice Age is still raging. It's still a rough environment on Earth. There's lots of climatic changes going on. Well, let me talk about the Ice Age, because this is just a mind blower in its authentication of God's Word. They found a map in, I don't know, probably 50 years ago or more, and it was actually produced in 1513, okay? It's Reis, he was an admiral in the Italian Navy when the Italians ruled the sea, and he drew a map that shows the coastline of Antarctica, all right? Trouble is, the coastline of Antarctica is under 5,000 feet of snow. No human being in modern history has ever seen the coastline of Antarctica, including someone in 1513. So how can he show where the rocks and the lands and the coves and the inlets are underneath of all that ice in 1513? Enormous mystery, all right? Until you apply a biblical filter to this event. He lists down here in the notes at the bottom of the map, amongst the sources he used to draw this part of the map was the Library of Alexandria. Now you type this into Wikipedia and see what they say about this map, and they say, this map is obviously a fake because in the notes it says the climate of this area was warm and temperate, and it is not, the coastline isn't exactly the way we see it today. So there's a few little spots that are wrong. After the flood, the oceans of the world had to have been much, much warmer. The Arctic Ocean was probably like the Bahamas. For hundreds of years after the flood, people were building ships. They were exploring this new creation. They were moving around the world after the Tower of Babel. They would have been documenting things, writing it down, bringing it back. Eventually, this information would have found its way into the Library of Alexandria, which was later destroyed. This admiral says this is some of that information. It shows what the world looked like during the Ice Age when the oceans were much warmer, and it would have been a warmer temperate climate. It all fits biblically. Makes no sense any other way. The map was sent to the United States Air Force in 1962, and I document this in the book Brilliant. The commander of the cartography department of the Air Force said, this map does accurately show what radar mapping of the rock coastline of Antarctica looks like underneath all this ice. And we have no idea how they could have done this in the 1500s. Because after the flood, they could have sailed there and seen it. And it makes perfect sense biblically. You know, this is what the coastline looks like today. The land surface is way back here somewhere, covered with the ice. Every textbook will tell you it's been under ice for 200,000 years. And yet this map shows it. Because the Bible's true. And we've got the time frames all wrong. And all that ice built up after the flood. This is the kind of thing that isn't being shared with the world around us. And then people were building these monumental building projects. Here's one of the things when we go to Peru, we see at a place called Sacsayhuaman, huge, almost 500,000-pound rocks cut like jigsaw puzzles to fit perfectly together. I don't know how we would do that today. And yet they did this 3,000 or more years ago. Now, I place this in the 3,000 to 4,000 year ago. And I don't know exactly where. But this precedes the Inca civilizations. The Incas weren't capable of doing this sort of thing. This was people that lived before them, and then they built on top of these kind of structures. You can't even put a credit card between the seams. I ran up and down and around, and I couldn't find a spot where I could stick back through there. They're so perfectly fit together. And as I said, some of the bigger ones weigh 400,000 pounds, and they're of unknown origin, preceding the Inca civilization. This lower area here, where these huge monoliths are, the Spanish, when they documented where this upper structure came from, they quoted people that had built that, but those people wrote it was a mystery where the older structure came from and how they were moved. Enormous stones, big structures. While the Incas are doing that, people are exploring North America. The American Indians didn't just show up 1,000 years, 2,000 years ago. There was stuff going on long before that in North America. The Indian mounds are attributed to much more ancient cultures than the Delawares and the Iroquois and the Pawnees and so on. They consider those sacred burial sites from previous ancestors. And I think they were happening in the 3,000 year ago range or older. In the early 1900s, there were people that were allowed to be digging in these, okay? They were looking for treasure, and they routinely would dig in these and bring some out. This is a book that was published in 1910 where the author documents the names, locations, and shows pictures of exactly some of the things that were pulled right out of these Indian mounds, these burial mounds. Now here's what these mounds look like. Here's an old 1900s pictures of these grave robbers who are looking for treasure, digging up these mounds. Here's one in Ohio, very commonly shaped like serpents. By the way, why do snakes keep showing up and being worshipped in all these ancient cultures? Because their twisted human perspective is it's the snake that brought enlightenment to mankind. And they worship the snake throughout these ancient cultures as they become removed from God. Here's another one in southern Ohio. Here's a pyramid-shaped one in Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, all over that area, preceding modern Indian tribes. Here's what came out of one of them. Now take a moment to take a look at this. This should blow your socks off, okay? Pulled right out of an ancient Indian mound. Shows a bunch of symbols, maybe a key or something. Then it shows a bunch of people drowning, trying to find high land. Then it shows a huge vessel with a bird with something in its beak flying away from it. And then it shows how many men coming off of this vessel. 1, 2, 3, 4. Noah and 3 sons worshiping as animals come off. Long before the Bible. There it is. People had knowledge of this stuff. It's real. And then there's others that show other things. Now, these are ignored by the experts. And then down in Peru, you find these burial stones that show people doing brain surgery. And there's examples in the museums, not just one, but dozens of examples of skulls with gold and metal plates embedded in openings that have been scraped into their skulls. Here's a close-up of what these things look like. And the bone has refused and regrown around the implanted plate. Now, these are known to be in excess of 2,000 years old, and probably some of them much older than that. Why were they doing this? I don't know. Maybe they were just having fun, experimenting with people's brains. They're a pretty ruthless culture, or maybe they were removing tumors. I don't know. Here's a burial stone pulled out of a grave that shows a doctor apparently removing part of somebody's intestine or stomach. This one, if you look close, there's a baby. Here's its nose, its eyes, its lips, its hands. It's being pulled out of a woman's womb. It's like a cesarean section early on, and here's an intricate drawing of a human heart. I doubt if it was heart surgery, personally. They're ruthless, as I said, but they sure knew their anatomy. Okay, here's just kind of a cool one. We just passed the year 2000, okay? And Newsweek magazine, Time magazine, they all ran an article. Who was, there's the man of the year with Life magazine, Time magazine. It was who was the man of the millennium? Who is the most influential human being that's changed human history more than anybody else in the last 1,000 years? So it's, what do we say? Alexander the Great. He goes much further back, okay? Just in the last 1,000 years. And after Jesus, obviously, is the man. But in the last 1,000 years, guesses. Columbus, great guess. Wrong. Da Vinci, good guess. I hear Isaac Newton. Charles Darwin would come up in any scientific circle. I haven't heard what they came up with yet. It's a good person, yeah. Nor Obama, by the way. But no modern presidents. Washington, nope. Got to give you the answer. We've got to move on. Gutenberg. Johannes Gutenberg. Because he allowed knowledge to be captured and disseminated in a widespread manner so the populace could be educated and knowledge wouldn't be lost. So and the first thing he printed was the Bible. By the way, there's about 20 of them left. They're worth, I think, $40 million each at this point, if anybody would be willing to sell one. The original Bible off the printing press, because he wanted the Bible to be disseminated. He wanted God's knowledge and truth to be out there with the masses. So that drove the Enlightenment. That drove the scientific Reformation. That drove the Reformation of the Christian church. That drove all of the changes that led to the modern world we live in today in the 1400s. Except he didn't invent movable type. The thing was to put a set of type in a tray and make multiple copies of it. This is an artifact that was found in pre-Greece, so it goes back about 31 or so hundred years ago. It preceded modern printing by 2,500 years, where they put hardened clay type in a tray, and they would use it to press out multiple copies of the same text. And they found, the Greeks at this point were just a bunch of little city empires. One empire would wipe out another. One of these happened to have survived. It's one of the most valued artifacts in one of the National Museum in Greece, but they were doing typesetting 2,500 years ago. The same concept, they just did it to clay instead of putting ink on it and pressing it to papyrus or paper. But they had developed it way before modern man. I just love this one because it's kind of cool. In Costa Rica, over 3,000 years ago, they liked to carve marbles, except they weren't little marbles, they were 6-foot diameter marbles, okay? Why? I don't know, but they found thousands of them buried in the ground. You look in the modern history textbooks, they're so common they set them up as lawn ornaments, okay, down there. 30,000 pounds some of these things weigh. They say, well, these were carved by the modern Costa Ricans in the about 600 to 1,000 years ago. Trouble is, the modern Costa Rica tribe don't have the kind of stone covering tools you needed. They're perfectly circular. There's no other examples that they've carved stuff, and they only had dugout canoes. And they found these same things 330 miles offshore from rocks that were carved onshore and carried to islands 300 miles away over the ocean. How do you do that in a dugout canoe with a 30,000-pound marble? See, what you read, you don't get the whole story. But you apply it biblically, and for whatever reason, these people were brilliantly inventive, creative, and capable of enormous technology. So, real quick, I'm going to walk you through 3,000 to 2,000 years ago. What's going on in this period of Earth history? Now we're starting to hear about the Greek Empire, and leading to the Roman Empire, leading to the great knowledge of mathematics and mankind, great advances in civilization. The Persians were in this time period. Lots of wars going on between cultures, but there's also a bunch of loss of previous knowledge. We lost typesetting because one kingdom wiped out another, and they didn't know what to do with it. I think we lost a lot of the Egyptian ability because they went through all sorts of depressions after the Exodus. One culture came and wiped them out. They didn't know what to do with necessarily their iron tools or whatever, so they just melted them down and used them for other purposes. But a lot of this stuff is highly guarded secrets because it knew they gave them an advantage as kingdoms.
Enormous amphitheaters with astounding acoustics where you can speak. And it's not just the shape, it's actually the materials they use that dampen certain frequencies and accentuate the human voice that allowed it to all work. They've studied this, and everywhere they went, they built these enormous amphitheaters. Ancient batteries. They had working batteries in Iraq over 2,000 years ago. They had an anode, a cathode. Mythbusters grabbed this idea and did a show based on it and showed they could use them for electroplating. And they found dozens of examples of these batteries. You go over to China. One of the emperors, he decided he wanted to be buried with an army. So before he died, he commissioned almost 10,000 full-size, 5-foot-tall Chinese figurines to be built. Terracotta, hollow clay, that looked like people. And they mixed and matched faces and bodies, and they had weapons, and they had acrobats, and they had magicians, and they had full-size horses, and they filled this enormous complex. They figured it would have taken several years with a labor force of 700,000 people. Now, just by comparison, when we put man on the moon, we spent about 10 years with a labor force of 400,000 people. They had to organize, feed, coordinate, and have mass organization with twice as many people to build this complex as we had when we put man on the moon. Just a different goal and a different accomplishment. But it shows the brilliance and intelligence of mankind from the very beginning. And they've only uncovered about 10% of this complex. And they were always painted with brilliant, vibrant individual paintings that peels off as soon as they're uncovered. Lifelike figurines. Move over to India. Look at India over 2,000 years ago. They decided to build a temple in a bunch of bauxite lava. So they just looked at a big rock lava wall and said, we're going to build a temple. Trouble is they didn't have anything except for hammers and chisels. Okay, that was their tools. Now think about the monumental effort as you look at what's inside of this. It sat empty for 1,700 years. They built it somewhere in the over 2,000 years ago. Worshipped there for 400 or 500 years. For whatever reason, it went empty. Sat there with bats and animals and tigers and lions and bears, oh my, pooping inside of this thing, okay? But look what survived, just open to the air for all this period. As you look inside of this, that's what it looks like inside. They have carved this out, left pillars, covered them with plaster, and when they painted it, they mixed the pigment with the plaster so that the color went all the way back through the plaster, and as it peeled off, it was still beautifully colorful. These are what their frescoes look like, even today, after sitting open to the air for 1,700 years. Every inch is covered with paintings and carvings and figurines. Wrong purpose, but the intelligence and brilliance of mankind is apparent throughout all these things. Last example, then we're going to take a break. The ancient Greeks. And this is known historically to be about 2,100 years old. They found a shipwreck in the Mediterranean in the early 1900s, collected all the coins and the pottery and threw this hunk of coral-encrusted junk on the shelf. Well, in the 1970s, someone found it and said, it looks a lot like a gear. I wonder what in the world that is. They did X-ray analysis of it in 1971. A team spent almost 20 years studying and reconstructing this thing. What they found is that there were 30 perfectly placed, interlinked bronze gears, and there was a lever on the back that they believe pointed to something that probably looked like this originally. So when you cranked the lever and turned it, it did this, and I'll explain in a second. But here's a quote by the head of the team that discovered this. He said, "This device is extraordinary. It's the only thing of its kind. It's absolutely gorgeous, and its astronomy is exactly right. It makes your jaw drop." And down at the bottom, he says, in terms of history and scarcity, this thing's more valuable than the Mona Lisa. One of a kind, because this is what it does. This is a reconstruction. As you turn the crank, the levers on the back will turn to different things, and it exactly plots the position of the sun, the moon, and the 5 visible planets anytime in the past or into the future.
It's a computational gear-driven computer from over 2,000 years ago. Now, intricate knowledge of astronomy, unbelievable intelligence and brilliance, superb metalwork. And if these skills have been lost for 1,500 years, how do we know there weren't people capable of it even further back than 2,100 years? It's like they didn't just one day wake up and make this thing. They knew they were building upon the knowledge and ability of people even further back than them. It's just so obvious how people have been made in the image of God. In ancient Peru, they've got dinosaur pots, really super thin, and they show things like dinosaurs. Look at this thing on the pot. What in the world is that if it's not a dinosaur? They had knowledge of this stuff. And we see dinosaurs showing up in Cambodia. We show them burial stones in Peru. Here's one that's been carved into the stone. Shows a sauropod kind of dinosaur. Here's one we've never even discovered yet with spikes coming out on its back. It's just on and on and on. They were digging aqueducts under the ground in Peru so the water wouldn't evaporate. Still been used 2,000 years later. They find a dry riverbed 20, 30 feet under the ground, and they put their aqueducts under the ground and take the water for miles to the farm fields. And there's still 30 of these kind of things in use. And you can spiral down to keep it cleaned out in a pathway underneath. The ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, they're filled with phenomenal knowledge and ability. It was essentially all lost. I mean, we slipped into the Dark Ages where we thought the world was flat again. So the idea that there wasn't knowledge from way on back in the 3,000 to 4,000 years ago that was simply lost is not at all illogical, because those things have went on throughout history. But while Western cultures were slipping into what we call the Dark Ages, the Chinese were still developing these brilliantly inventive things. This one's kind of interesting. It's a 6-foot-tall bronze seismometer. They invented over 2,000 years before modern man the ability to detect both the occurrence and the direction of earthquakes. And the concept of mathematics and paper making and explosives and all this stuff. The Great Wall of China was 13,000 miles long, built over a 2,000-year period. It was their superhighway. It wasn't just for defense. Ending in the Colosseum, enormous technology. They could flood it and have naval battles on the floor. So you weren't hot while you watched people wipe each other out. They had curtains they pulled over to keep the sun out of your eyes. I want to make sure you could see all this blood flying everywhere. Now, here's where I want to wrap up. They knew about the flood. They knew about the Garden of Eden. They knew where sin came from. They knew about Noah. When you deny these, what is the consequence? Everything becomes relative. Instead of having a creator who tells us what's right and what's wrong and what's true and what's false, we start to make up our own opinions. You get enough people to agree with you, that becomes the majority opinion. Morality will absolutely, inevitably degenerate. Life will inevitably become cheapened, and every society will inevitably fall apart. And that is the history of humanity throughout known history, throughout recorded history. And by the way, it's all been recorded. There is no such thing as prehistory or prehistoric, because the Bible tells us this frame. That's what I went through. All of history is there. And I've shown you how it fits. Now, I may not be right about every little nuance, but at least it's a logical framework to show how things can fit in. Now, I ended the book Brilliant with this kind of my perception of what did God mean when he said we were made in his image. Obviously, God is spirit, so he didn't mean we physically look exactly like he looks. But one of those ways is our creativity and our intelligence. I think another way is our ability to use language and assign symbolic symbols with meaning. No other animal can do that. There's nothing else in creation that can do that. God does that. He communicates from the get-go. Third is our ability to have empathy and compassion to others. Animals don't do that, okay? But the fourth way is what I want to end with. We have been given freedom to choose right from wrong. We've been given the freedom to choose truth from a lie. God will allow us to choose a lie if we choose to. He does not take that freedom away, because that's the essence of who he is. He's given us that in part of his image. And I'll tell you the best example I've found of that This isn't part of the fall, by the way. This is how he built us. He built the human brain with the ability to accept what is not true if we choose to accept it. Okay? But there is enormous consequences to that. The lens in our eye actually takes an image and flips it upside down. That's a scientific fact. It's how the optics work. So when I'm standing up here looking at you, in the back of your eye, I am actually upside down. Everything's upside down. So why don't you see me standing on my head upside down? Because your brain takes that upside down image and it flips it right side up and it interprets it as if I'm standing right side up, even though the image is upside down. Now, you can't stop your brain from doing that. It does it automatically. And you don't even know that your brain is doing that. It's taking something and flipping it 180 degrees and you don't even know it. It's how God built our brains with that ability. Now, I want to show you a little clip of a scientist. Now, this goes back a few decades, but it's just as true today. He decided, I'm going to put an extra lens in front of my eye so it flips things right side up, and then my lens will flip it upside down, and I want to see what my brain will do with that, and if it will keep seeing it upside down, or how long it'll take for it to adjust, or if it'll ever adjust. And one last thought by a man who studied how the human brain works all his life. He said, and this is one of his conclusions of a lifetime of work studying the human brain, there's nothing that's too absurd to be believed if you simply repeat it often enough. This is really profound, and we're going to come back to it, because it is absolutely true, and it's part of how we were built. But watch this little video clip.
For example,
okay, turn up the sound.
Done only in the eye.
Okay.
Everything would be upside down to us. Just as in a camera, the lens of the eye forms the image upside down. The image is then inverted by the brain so that it appears right side up. Now, what would happen if a lens system were used to form the image right side up? Well, the brain would immediately invert the image so that it would be upside down. But would this condition be permanent? To answer this question, we asked Mr. Gratz, our optical expert, to design for us a pair of inverting spectacles. While the spectacles were being constructed in our shop, we faced the problem of who was going to wear the things continuously for several weeks. You'll want to meet our unlucky winner. That's right, me. Even from the first, it was possible to walk in this topsy-turvy fashion, but it didn't take long to develop a rollicking case of seasickness. We decided that for your sake as well as ours, we'd better conduct our first test sitting down. However, just sitting down wasn't so easy. Even the simplest tasks were at first impossible. No amount of concentration or effort could overcome the compulsion to reach in the wrong direction. The inverting spectacles had to be worn every waking moment during the entire period of the experiment. Anytime the glasses were removed, the eyes were closed or fully covered. Walking to work upside down was an exhausting experience, but it provided a valuable period of relearning and reorientation. It also caused quite a stir in the neighborhood. Gradually, it became easier to get around in this upside-down world. By a slow and painful process, the image in the brain had been erected.
Now, I've got one more clip after this, but there's a really important point even right here. It took about 2 weeks. I mean, he's walking around, everything's upside down for 2 weeks. But after 1 week, it's not like things were at 45 degrees, and then eventually after 10 days, they were at 70 degrees, and then eventually they were right side up again. His brain's getting information and it's thinking, this isn't right, there's something wrong. This isn't right, there's something wrong. And all of a sudden, it said, this must be the new reality. This is now the truth. And our brains will take that and it will now make that the new framework through which it will filter everything that comes into the brain. And now that's the only thing that's going to be perceived as truth. That's the way our brains will work. Now, lest you think, yeah, but I won't be deceived by the truth. You know, I can't be deceived. I know what's true. Honestly, how do any of us know for sure what is true? How do we know for sure what the past is? It's always based on what somebody's told us. You know, 2 + 2 is 4. Unless you're a mathematical, brilliant genius, you can't prove it with mathematics. And you've been told that. We base what we believe on what we've been told. So if we're being told something wrong, it's going to have an impact to the point where we can be blinded.
The two ends obviously are parallel.
They bring the lights down.
But the two sides are not parallel because the two ends are not the same length. This figure we call a trapezoid. Now let's remove the cover. Are you a bit confused? Well, all we've done is cut some holes in the figure and painted it to look like a window frame. But maybe you say, well, you can't fool me, that's still a trapezoid. Well, it's still a trapezoid, all right. But now let's revolve the figure and see what happens. Does the window frame seem to turn, then stop, and reverse directions? Well, such is not the case. It is revolving continuously in a clockwise direction. Now, even when we know this, the illusion still persists, and it looks more like a window all the time. Well, maybe you need a reference point. See if the cube will help you follow the edge of the trapezoid all the way around. Watch closely now. Doesn't help a bit, does it? Not only does the trapezoid still oscillate back and forth, but the cube actually seems to take off and go floating through space. Now, it doesn't, of course. Actually, the cube has been firmly attached to the edge of the figure all the time. Now, an iron bar should make a good solid reference point. Let's see what happens now when we rotate the window. Of course, we know that the revolving window frame cannot possibly bend the iron bar or cause it to cut through the window frame. But this knowledge seems to be of no help at all. The illusion of an oscillating window still continues. From earliest childhood, it has been our experience that windows are rectangles and that all sides are parallel. Your eye sent an accurate image to the brain, the image of a trapezoid painted like a window. But your mind said, that's a window. And rather than give up the idea that all windows are rectangular, your mind accepted all sorts of improbable things. Solid bars bending or cutting through solid matter without even leaving a hole.
Now, this is unbelievably relevant and profound. I mean, I got to make sure you get this. Your brain, it saw that window going around and around. It saw that cube going around and around, but it refused to let you think that was happening. They showed this same video to people in Africa where they've never seen a rectangular window. Their brain has only seen round windows. They said, what do you see? They see, well, we see that figure going around and around. We see that cube attached to it going around and around. They saw what was really happening. Your brain won't let you because it's been trained to think in only a certain way. And you literally can't see it any other way. Now, put that in the perspective of all those things we read in God's Word about. Keep my word as a lamp unto your feet. Write my precepts upon your heart, upon the doorposts of your home. Renew your minds with what? With God's Word. Keep it in front of you. Think upon what is holy and what is right and what is true. Because you realize what he's saying from beginning of Scripture to end. If we don't do that, we're going to start accepting what's a lie, and that lie will become the filter through which we filter everything else. See, we can't be mad at the educational world because they can't see the truth right in front of their face. They're trained to think in a different way from the time they're little children. Hearing about millions of years this, billions of years that, millions of years, billions of years. That means there's been millions and billions of years of death and disease and bloodshed and extinction because the rock layers are filled with that. And if they're that old, that's been around all that time. So where's God in all that anyway? He becomes increasingly irrelevant in their minds. In the Bible, it becomes increasingly fantasy in their minds. But we're to be the light on the hill. And don't cover it with a basket. You see, if this is the problem, I mean, if this is what's going on and why people can't acknowledge all this reality from the past and see it in a biblical framework, it's because they've been trained to think in a different way to the point they can't even see anything different. They can't interpret it different ways. Whether they're a PhD genius professor or a small child hearing about millions of years ago dinosaurs died out. All of that's a non-biblical perspective of looking at things. So if that's the problem, what is the solution? We, as Christians who know the truth, have to repeat over and over and over and over again the mighty acts of God as if they're real, as if they really happened, because they did. It is the truth. It is history, and we got to keep it in front of people. And then that crack will open up, and they're going to be led toward who is this God anyway, and want to know more about him, and want to make him their personal Savior. And that's what all this is about. Not about science and evidence and facts and history, but about reality and who is God, and putting his great works in front of people.